I've started to see 4 or 5 questions come through. Just a reminder to everyone for the balance of the conversation to take part. Please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. I'm now going to bring in for some reaction and then explanation of a host of the issues that were simply raised but not explored. Wayne Cruz and Ryan Young, two of our leaders here at CEI focused on regulatory issues. Wayne, if I could, I'll just start with you for a moment and ask, what jumped out at you about what Paul said? What were the most important points that really stood out for you?
Yeah, Kent, there were a lot of things in there, but I think the big takeaway from it is that especially the new executive order and the executive orders that came out last year on guidance too, in my opinion, represent a restoration of the rule of law in the regulatory process. As Paul Ray had pointed out early in the talk, Congress is supposed to make our law. That's what's in Article 1. And he made the point that the reason for that is Congress representing such an array of interest. It's drawn from the people. It's got an incentive to limit executive power. All those points that Paul Ray made matter a lot. But when the progressive era took root and the administrative state grew and the executive branch and the independent agencies grew, that rule of law deteriorated. And you ended up with a situation where, as Paul said, agency interest clashed with the regulated public's interest. The agency had an interest in being vague. The public needs the rules to be specific. So a lot of what Paul Ray's discussion covered was making, in this new executive order, which operates within the rule of law, and it says 5 times in the executive order, everything here has to be consistent with the rule of law. But presenting that regulatory bill of rights, so to speak, that phrase isn't actually in the executive order, but that's what these 10 points have come to mean. And expanding something like that across the agencies, treating people with fairness, is something that everyone can get behind. You asked about what could be next in a coronavirus package and whether you could have something with respect to never needed rules or a reg commission. One thing I think does have some legs with both political parties is the notion of transparency that he brought up. And if people know what's legal and what's not legal and where the lines are, I think it makes a big difference. So it's very, very important, the statements that were made, and there's good and bad in the Trump regulatory and spending agenda. But I'll tell you, the way that the administrative process is working at OMB is something that to me is unique. Someone mentioned Executive Order 12866 that had come under Clinton. That was really an extension of Ronald Reagan's executive order on regulatory cost benefit review. That left a legacy for Reagan. This kind of action for Trump in terms of fairness to the public and new things like disclosure of guidance documents and so forth can be a legacy for the Trump administration. Some of that would be hard even for a new president, or Trump to lose in this year or when he leaves in 2025. That would be something hard to overturn by a new president. So I think there's a lot of important groundwork being laid here. We're not getting back to Article 1 in the Constitution, but to the extent that you can restrain the administrative state and make it fair to the public, I think these are really, really important steps. But as Paul said, you do have to get buy-in from the judiciary, buy-in from Congress, but it's very important steps.
Ryan, I'd like to ask you about institutions to bring you into this conversation. I think it's lost sometimes when we get into the Federalist Papers, we get into checks and balances and the source of authority for government, that there are real people running these agencies, and these agencies each have unique cultures and styles. Across the regulatory state, there are thousands of people at work churning out new rules day after day. The office that Paul leads at OMB has some 4 or 5 dozen people. Is it possible, and how likely is it, that we'll see a small dedicated band of people get together and reshape the trajectory of all those other institutional players at these agencies that are creating the rules? What is your confidence interval on institutional change, given what we've seen in the last 3.5 years come out of organizations like OIRA and OMB?
It's higher than it's been in a long time. When the administration first came in, I had high hopes, but they only did executive orders. The other branches didn't so much cooperate. Right now, we're at a moment where people like Paul Ray are in at OIRA. He gets it. We've seen a series of executive orders that also get it. And by it, I mean the fact that it's not enough to get rid of this or that regulation. You have to reform the process that makes those regulations possible in the first place. The problem isn't so much the rules as it is the system. And I was encouraged by some of Paul's remarks that are aware of that, because so many political figures are very much in the moment. They have a very concrete outlook on things where they see a problem, they do something to fix it, and they forget to address the underlying issues that make that possible in the first place. So earlier you alluded to a BRAC-style commission that would essentially put together an omnibus package of old rules for Congress to get rid of and do this every year. That's one thing that would change the rules of the process to get rid of the giant stock of existing rules. For example, in Wayne's 10,000 Commandments study that just came out, released by CEI, he found that the Code of Federal Regulations, which is where all these rules are stored, is more than 185,000 pages long. That's a bit much. And there's also not just that giant stock of existing rules, there's a flow of new rules coming in every year. Another number that Wayne comes up with is what he calls the Unconstitutionality Index. Congress is supposed to pass all laws and perform all legislating. And in an average year, they pass 100 some regulations. In an average year, executive branch agencies pass more than 3,000 new regulations. Last year was the first time since records started being kept in the 70s that that number was under 3,000. Even so, that unconstitutionality index, that ratio was 28-1. For every law Congress passes, agencies make 28 of their own. That needs to be another target of institution level reform, because the system itself is ultimately, for the long run, what needs to change, not just getting rid of the never needed rules that are getting in the way of healthcare or economic recovery.
Wayne, I thought Ryan was going to touch on a favorite topic of yours. Could you explain for folks how an office of no would tie in with this? I often think of it as a devil's advocate position within the regulatory process.
I'm glad you asked me that, because when Paul was speaking, it was reminding me that occasionally OIRA gets a lot of blowback from groups on the left. They say you shouldn't have this group intervening in the public notice and comment process and getting into the way of the public comment approach. OIRA is the only thing we have in the administrative state, which is not a part of the Constitution. It's the only thing we have in the administrative state that puts the brakes on, taps the brakes on just a little bit. And even with that, it can't review everything. As Ryan just mentioned, and thanks for the plug, Ryan, but as he just mentioned, there are 3,000 regulations coming through every year. Of those, about 600 or so count as major that OIRA can glance at as they go flying by. And then of those, then there's just a few dozen that will have cost analysis, and much fewer than that that even have a cost benefit analysis. So most regulations go through without that cost benefit analysis. What I was referring to in the Office of No, and I talked about this in a book chapter at one time, and in a short piece I did the other day. Often you'll hear people say, "Well, OIRA needs more resources to do the things that it does," and I agree with that. I wouldn't have a problem with expanding its budget a little bit. I mean, who cares at this point, right? The budget, the federal deficit this year is going to be larger than the entire spending budget was back in 2015. It's amazing what's going on. But an Office of No is like putting brakes on. Back when Trump did the 2-for-1 executive order that you talked about, Kent, he also paired that with so-called task forces in each agency to review regulations. It's kind of like, almost like commission at the local level. Agencies would each look at their rules and look at what they can get rid of. But there's nothing in the federal government that says no to the rules and regulations that come by. And by the term Office of No, I don't just mean somebody that's reviewing the regulations, but that if our goal is to remove and shrink the federal government and put regulation where it really belongs, which is in private, you always have a choice between political discipline and competitive discipline. That's what Fred Smith would always say. There's never such a thing as no regulation. Your choice is, do political actors and agencies do it best, Or do upstream business suppliers, downstream business customers, the media, Wall Street, consumers, all of these forces that regulate get locked out by the administrative process sometimes. So you need an office in each agency, because I like to roll back agencies. I like the idea of sunsetting them, getting rid of them, turning regulations back over to the private sector. Laissez-faire doesn't mean companies get to run wild. It means they obey the rule of law. But we overemphasize the notion of market failure, which is what drives so much regulation. So I think if you have an entity, the only entity there would be, that say, well, here's what we can do to not do this regulation, to roll it back, and when has this agency done its job and we can step aside. There's nothing that does that. All the incentives in an agency or in the administrative state are for the agency to grow. Examples of that: look at the new executive orders on artificial intelligence. Look at the new frontier sectors. Rather than government stepping back, there's more calls for federal funding and public-private partnerships. Everything is moving in the direction and pushing in the direction of expanding the administrative state, expanding government's reach, especially in new frontier sectors. So you need something that takes the opposite approach and say, here's how we need to get government out. And I know there are other folks on this call, and if other folks are interested in that, or talking to folks on the Hill about the notion of what do you replace the administrative state with, I think that's what our movement, the free market, small L libertarian movement, however you want to say, needs to explore. We've got a lot of work to do there, and it's not just improving the administrative state, but replacing it with real regulation and real discipline.
Ryan, could you pick up on that last point for us? You made a comment earlier about it's not just the rules, it's the system. What reforms do you have in mind for the Administrative Procedures Act? This is a legislation that came out, I believe, in the wake of World War II. It has really set the parameters for how we regulate for generations now. What sort of changes or updates or modernizations would you recommend there?
We've got some ideas. For background, the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, was passed in 1946, and that's where we got the outlines of the regulatory process as we know it today. When an agency comes out with a new regulation, before it comes into effect, it has to publish it in the Federal Register. There has to be a waiting period so the public can comment on it, and the agencies are required to take that into account. That's the overall system that we've had in place since 1946, and it's certainly better than no transparency safeguards at all. At the same time, there's a lot of room for improvement. And one of those improvements is that there is an exemption built into the process where if there's an emergency, or if there's they call it the good cause exemption. If a rule is self-obviously urgent or a good idea, then it can pass without having to go through that notice and comment regulation process. But that exemption does not apply to rollbacks. It should. That is something that Congress would likely have to legislate, because the APA is a bill of Congress. I don't think that's something the executive can do unilaterally.
So could you just explain that for a moment? It sounds like for good cause, when we have one of these exogenous shocks, like a war, a pandemic, the ratchet is set that we can only have new regulation for good cause. We cannot have deregulation for good cause. Is that what you're telling us?
That's right. And as it is, there's actually more to it than that. For an agency to get rid of a rule, it has to put out a new rule saying it wants to get rid of the old rule, and that itself has to go through the notice and comment process. The agency can't simply say this rule is costing however many millions of dollars in unneeded costs. Technology has changed, it's obsolete now, or the paperwork burdens are unfair. It has to go through the whole notice and comment process, and that is something that, if it's possible to add burdens with the good cause exemption, it should also be possible to remove them with the good cause exemption.
Okay, I want to remind everyone of the Q&A function. I could do this all afternoon. I have plenty of questions for these guys, but this isn't about me and my peculiar interests. Wayne, one thing we didn't get into with Paul Ray, it was on my list. In fact, I know that you know it's one of my hobby horses, but could you explain to folks where independent agencies fit in with the recent executive orders on regulation? And here I'm focused on the dark matter and the guidance posting of guidance documents that is recently required, and soon we're coming up on a deadline, as well as the deregulate to stimulate effort that was talked about last month.
Yeah, Kent. This is one of the dilemmas. A little bit. It's kind of parallel to what Ryan was talking about it being difficult to get rid of regulations. In a sense, I'd heard somebody phrase it: you can't get under the administrative state. You can't get rid of a regulation. You can only replace it with a new one. And that's one of the tough things about it. There had been a study, in fact, just a few years ago. I believe it was a GAO report. It could have been Congressional Research Service, but of all the rules that came out, including major rules, nearly a third of them were issued with no proposed rulemaking at all. They just came out as an interim final rule. So it's very easy to use that exemption and to grow things. The problem can be even worse with the independent agencies, because things like the Paperwork Reduction Act do apply to independent agencies. But remember, this whole regulatory process we have that we're talking about being such a great thing at OIRA really is applying just to the executive branch agencies. The independent agencies get a pass. Now, they are encouraged to weigh in. Even President Obama did 4 executive orders that were related to regulatory relief, and I praised them mightily when they came out. And one of the provisions was, well, independent agencies ought to chip in and try to comply too. Trump's executive order 1 in, 2 out didn't apply to independent agencies. Invited them in, they didn't have to do it, and they didn't. Now, I would say, in contrast to that though, the FCC, an independent agency, its rollback of net neutrality regulations at that time probably outweighed all of the other savings that had been taking place that year under 2 for 1, but it didn't count up in the process. Paul had mentioned 50 billion happening in savings is going to be surpassed this coming year, and that probably has a lot to do with Clean Power Rule and with CAFE standards. But independent agencies are now, I mentioned frontier sectors, they're among the biggest regulators now. And yet they're not subject to these executive orders. So as I say, they are invited. And it is the case that it's a bipartisan hobby horse, using your term, that independent agencies should be under. Paul Ray's predecessors in the Office of Management and Budget had signed a letter at one point saying that independent agencies ought to be brought under some of the cost-benefit review. But the reason this, you mentioned independent agencies and guidance. When I wrote the initial, I got upset about guidance a few years back when I was seeing, the president said, I have a pen and I have a phone and I can do these things. I got upset about independent agencies back then because I felt like, it's not a law from Congress, as Ryan mentioned, there are about 100 or so. It's not one of the 3 levels, but it's all of these guidance documents that agencies are putting out. Independent agencies in particular do that. And a couple of years back, there had been a Congressional Review Act vote on one of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau rules with respect to lending and so forth. But it had come out, it was a big rule, but it had come out, it was a guidance document. It wasn't a rule, it wasn't a notice and comment regulation. Same with the independent contractor rule from standards from the Department of Labor, the franchising rule from the Department of Labor. This stuff was guidance documents, not even the regulations that we're talking about here. So bringing the independent agencies in is vital. And as I pointed out in the new 10,000 Commandments too, this kind of thing can quickly get out of control. At one point, President Trump was talking about a national 5G network, which would be overseen at FCC, and that would be in the future out of control of anything that OIRA does. Similarly with the financial agencies, the Federal Reserve was interested in a national payment system that our own John Burlow wrote a tremendous amount about, of replacing the behind the scenes payment systems that the private sector banks are. So there were a lot of things like that that were potentially problematic. The FCC, the securities agencies wanting to regulate cryptocurrencies as a security, although Congress hadn't called it a security, the agencies would do. That would be an independent agency doing it, not a whole heck of a lot that OIRA could say. So we're doing these great things, and I stand by what I said earlier about what Paul and the team there and what Trump has done in this ambit of OIRA being probably the best we could hope for. But there's too much leakage. There's guidance document leakage, there's all the independent agency leakage, and the willingness of agencies to regulate for good cause, as Ryan was talking about. So all of that thing has to be brought in. And you were asking a little bit about what kinds of things we could do, and transparency was brought up earlier. part of it is we've got to get to some of it. It's not going to solve the problem of restoring Article 1, but we've got to get some of the Democratic side and use this notion of fairness. The left is very big on fairness, as we all should be, and use that notion of fairness to make sure that the regulatory state is transparent. They could start, hey, compiling data on the regulatory state, and I could quit writing 10,000 commandments, right? They could do all these things and make it easier and make it more transparent for the public to see. But I'm glad you brought up independent agencies, because as we were talking about earlier about people weighing in on things like the Office of No and what kind of next steps we have to take to clamp down on administrative state abuses, we've really got to make big, big decisions about independent agencies, when it's appropriate for them to regulate and when we have to say no to them and stop them and make sure that they don't get and take advantage of these loopholes, because they're just not bound by these executive orders. They're invited, but they're not bound.
We have the queue filling up. I'm going to see if I can ask 3 quick questions of you all. We'll move through these. Leslie is asking, again, on guidance and the recent executive order. She's concerned about the question of things that are not posted. Will it, in fact, as the black letter of the executive order suggests, have no effect? How confident are you that guidance documents that cannot be found or identified or clearly stated will, in fact, disappear?
Yeah. This is Wayne. I wrote a piece late last year, kind of tongue-in-cheek, called The Deep State Guide to Bypassing Trump's Executive Order on Dark Matter. and I made the point that I think that while Trump is in office and while Paul Ray is monitoring these, because as I see it, he's monitoring these extremely closely. He had an immediate answer to your question about what they're going to do in 2 weeks when the deadline comes due. So I think under the Trump administration, there is going to be a focus on them and holding their feet to the fire. But remember, they're the independent agencies, who are some of the biggest regulators, don't have to participate in the database. It's called a portal. That's what it's called in the executive order. They don't have to participate in it to the same degree. The other concern I had was if Trump lost this year, you wouldn't expect a new president or a new OMB director or a new OIRA director to enforce the database. And as I read the executive order, just the OMB administrator alone could dispense with the portal. And that was why in writing up some things earlier this year on what I was calling some cleaning up the tailings, that Trump is going to have to do after the July deadline. I think he's going to have to do a reinforcement executive order, clamping down where the guidance didn't appear, which agencies weren't doing it, make sure it gets posted, but he's got to tie up loose ends with respect to that, because I think the loophole of the next administrator being able to dispense with it is too much. I think, but that executive order, though, given that it's transparency related, does have legs. It can stick around in a new administration if that's what we're faced with. But I think that the executive order is not enough. There was a Russell Vought memo that came out after the executive order on how agencies were to comply and things like that. Didn't get a lot of attention in the media and the press, which, it's a regulatory issue, so that's the way that goes. But it didn't get a lot of attention it needed to. But I do feel like after we survey and glance at things this summer and see what we have in the guidance portal, see what we have in the new unified agenda, see where we come out later this year on the 1 in, 2 out, there will need to be some Trump executive orders in addition to this new one that he's done on fairness that tie things together and help create a legacy there, kind of like the Reagan one.
We have a question from William following up on the discussion about good cause exemptions. Ryan, do you have a sense, can you share how often are these used compared to other rulemaking processes?
I don't know. It's usually restricted to times of crisis, such as war or economic emergency, but I don't have a number for how often it's used.
Okay, that's maybe part of our 2021 research agenda.
On that quick question. Actually, that's a good point, Kent. I'd mentioned a little bit earlier about a GAO report about it, and now this was a few years ago. I think it was 2012, but we need to update it. it found that of all the final rules that came out, there were a third of them that didn't have a notice of proposed rulemaking at all. They had just used these interim final rules, and the typical reason for using an interim final rule is the good cause justification. So as I say, there are a lot of leaks in the boat, in the administrative state boat, but these are leaks that make the government bigger, not smaller. So.
Yeah, and Wayne, to build off your earlier point about guidance documents, you use the larger term dark matter to describe all new regulations that don't go through that required notice and comment process. There's more than guidance. Agencies will issue rules that are essentially legally binding via press releases or blog posts. It's not just guidance. And so far, a lot of actions have focused only on guidance. So I think we need a broader focus on, well, a broader approach to dark matter and combating it.
Absolutely. It's like a word salad. I did one, they used to have these word clouds on the web where it would just be a smattering of words, and the ones that we use the most would appear in larger type and larger font. And I'd done one like that, kind of all the different kinds of guidance. So, there's guidance, notices, bulletins, letters, circulars, administrative interpretations, all these kinds of ways that agencies get, they nudge you. There's certain folks who like the idea of nudge. I'm not a fan of that, but they can use all of these mechanisms to get the public to act or influence them to adhere. Nice business you got there. There are ways of influencing the public, and guidance documents let agencies do that. And I'm glad you brought that point up too, because one of the loopholes in the guidance document order was a lot of those things that you just mentioned that would influence public's behavior. Guess what? They don't have to be part of the portal, and they need to be. And that's what I meant about tying up loose ends. But we'll have a better feel for this in July and August, I feel like. And I'll probably update the dark matter paper and survey some of this stuff.
That word salad does not seem to comport with Paul Ray's use of James Madison's just, wise, and simple description for the way we ought to create law. Another very quick question before we start to wrap up. Rich is asking about the recent SCOTUS ruling on DACA, Supreme Court ruling on the immigration law and regulatory implementation. Question is, what may this mean for the status of actions that are considered arbitrary and capricious in the future? Do you see that the ruling could hold future administrations to a higher standard? Have either of you looked at that?
I've not looked at it carefully, but I get the sense that it was a more narrow ruling, which means that it will likely have limited effect as a precedent. So whether you like the policy outcome or whether you don't, I don't think it'll have a whole lot of effect on future agency behavior, both inside and outside the immigration issue.
Yeah, I really hope that's the correct result. I haven't read the decision yet, but the thing that struck me initially when I first heard about it was, the idea that a president can easily do things initially with a pen. And remember, it wasn't even the president; it was DHS that had just done memos that created these program extensions. If it's easy for a president to start them, it's a concern to me that it's not easy for a president to stop them. But I haven't gone through and read what the narrowness of this is and why what President Obama did in initiating it without going through process was okay, and why what Trump tried to initiate, and he's now tried for 3 years to change something that way, is not appropriate. That was problematic to me just in hearing it, because I'm not an immigration specialist. I had only added the DACA into the initial dark matter paper because it was an example of rule by memoranda. See, it was memoranda from DHS. So that was my concern about it. And so when I go and look, I may look at it different from a legal scholar. When I get a chance to work the new dark matter paper and look at the decision, I might be thinking about it a little bit differently than they do, in terms of, it's always been said that one president could do an executive order and another one could immediately overturn it. Well, it turns out that's not the case. And that means something. And that's what I want to investigate a little bit more with regard to that decision.
I'm about to ask each of you for final comments, give you 30 seconds to wrap up or send us off with parting thoughts into the afternoon. But I do have an all-star, perhaps it's a question, perhaps it's a comment. It's the last one in my queue. It comes from Fred and Fran Smith. And I'll just read verbatim what it says for the two of you to see if we can get a quick reaction as part of your closing remarks on the day and the conversation we've had about repeal for resilience. How about the no agency? It would get its funding from getting rid of regulations, and the results in cost savings. Something of an eat what you kill approach to government deregulators. What do you think of that?
I think economists love to talk about incentives. That provides a very sound incentive structure, and that's something that whether these institution level reforms are coming to us through the executive, through the legislature, or preferably some combination of the two, those sort of incentive structures are the things that need to be looked at and enacted things to make sure that people behave the way that they're supposed to. People will tend to behave that way if they have an incentive to, such as increasing their own budget through doing good rather than ill. So I think Fred and Fran are right on there.
Yeah, let Fred and Fran. It's a great new project. We'll be we'll be booting it up and having a happy hour. It sounds like a great thing to do. You got to get the incentives lined up.
All right, very good. A couple quick reminders for our audience. Excerpts of this will be available on YouTube. We'll make sure that you have a link to it. Thank you for joining us. We will be back online. The Competitive Enterprise Institute will host a book talk with our own senior fellow, John Berlau. He has a forthcoming book, George Washington, Entrepreneur. I'll be joined with John by Deirdre McCloskey, longtime friend of CEI, winner of our Julian L. Simon Memorial Award, and just all around scholar of not only the Renaissance, but the ideas that make life better. So we're very much looking forward to that on July 7th. And we will have a series of programs available through July and August. I encourage you to stay involved with us via email and the website. With that, we've come to a conclusion for today. I want to thank you both, Ryan and Wayne, for the work that you're doing and being part of the conversation. And with that, our Zoom is over.